Welcome back after the break. Now for stories in detail. We start from Iran, which has refused to hold any negotiations with the US unless it takes steps to de-escalate. In a statement, President Hassan Rouhani said the present conditions only allow for resistance. Iran has increased the production of low-enriched uranium. This comes after Iran officially stopped some commitments under the 2015 accord in response to US sanctions. Previously, US President Donald Trump said Tehran will have to take the first step if it wants to negotiate. Trump warned Iran against any act of aggression.
I think Iran would be making a very big mistake if they did anything. If they do something, it'll be met with great force, but we have no indication that they will.
Britain has warned Iran against provoking the US. Speaking in Geneva, Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt said he's held discussions with US counterpart Mike Pompeo about tensions with Iran and said Britain wants the situation to de-escalate.
Well, I would say to the Iranians, do not underestimate the resolve on the US side in this situation. They are not seeking a conflict. They don't want a war with Iran. But if American interests are attacked, they will retaliate. And that is something that the Iranians need to think about very, very carefully.
And the US has temporarily scaled back restrictions on China's tech giant Huawei. Dismissing the move, founder Ren Zhengfei said Huawei is prepared for any US action. Ren says the US government is underestimating the company. Meanwhile, the US Commerce Department says it will allow Huawei to purchase American-made goods. The decision will provide software updates to existing Huawei handsets. But the Chinese firm is still prohibited from buying American parts to make new products. U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross says the new orders will give telecom operators time to make other arrangements. The U.S. says the restrictions were imposed after Huawei's suspected involvement in acts against national security. For more on this, we are joined by our Beijing correspondent, Patrick Falk. Thank you for joining us, Patrick. So firstly, U.S. restrictions on Huawei have weighed on the tech-heavy NASDAQ exchange in the U.S. and bourses in East Asia. Do you expect the market's reaction to be short-lived, or are there longer-term economic repercussions?
Well, look, there was actually a little bit free for markets today after the US eased up on some of those restrictions on Huawei. As you mentioned, it is temporarily lifting a ban on sales to Huawei so that it can continue to maintain and service existing equipment, but it won't be able to do that to manufacture any new products. The Commerce Department has said that this is so that telcos can make alternative arrangements in the meantime. And it gives you an idea of just how much of a disruption this is to supply chains and how problematic this is for consumers as well. So this is going to have a huge impact on markets, and notably, as one economist put it, the Iron Curtain has been raised. The chief economist of DBS Group said that China will no longer be able to rely on America as input suppliers, and that it will need to be more self-reliant. So what we're actually seeing and what's being talked about increasingly is a sort of decoupling of economies, decoupling of China and the US. And so that is going to have far-reaching implications for markets in the long term and also for global growth.
Right, and Huawei's founder has said the US is underestimating the strength of the company and it has a clear edge over its Western competitors in 5G technology. What can Beijing do to protect Chinese companies with technological advantages from US political attacks?
Well, China has actually been really quite restrained in the past few weeks in its response to some of the action that's been taken by the US. And notably, since these new measures have been taken against Huawei specifically, it hasn't retaliated just yet. However, it is noticeable that in the last few days that China has been giving some sort of signals about what sort of action it might take. Xinhua news agency has actually reported just in the last couple of days that President Xi Jinping has paid a visit to a rare earths mining facility in Jiangxi, one of the largest in the country, in fact. And that sends an important signal to the US, because it's essentially Xi Jinping saying that if you want to continue with this fight and use components against us, we may just stop all exports of rare earth minerals that are required to manufacture these components. And that is very significant indeed, because China actually provides 80% of the minerals required to produce these components to the US. Companies themselves are also taking action, and there's lots of indications that Huawei has been prepared for this sort of scenario. We've mentioned before that it's already started producing its own processors, it's developing its own operating system, and Ren Zhengfei also in that interview today said that Huawei has been stockpiling chips in order to outlast this trade war if it is prolonged. So look, Beijing is certainly making a stance, and Huawei is making a stance, and it's saying that if the US wants to have a fight, it's ready to have one with it.
Right, and you spoke of restrictions a lot, and the restrictions on Huawei and Washington's imposition of further punitive trade tariffs on Beijing has coincided with further US shows of military strength in the South China Sea. Does China see these developments as part of the same American strategy, or is it dealing with these issues separately?
Well, look, I think all these issues are intertwined. The South China Sea, North Korea, trade, technology, these things are all very intricately meshed with one another, although China may not necessarily want to link these things, because it sees the South China Sea as a domestic issue. It sees it as its sovereign territory, and it's important to it strategically, also partly because it wants to bring Taiwan back into the fold in the future. So the answer is, look, it's undeniable that the US is trying to make a statement to China and trying to contain China, which some people will say that that China has been flexing its muscles, but China will see this as an example of the US provoking it, although it doesn't necessarily want to link the South China Sea with some of these more complex trade issues.
Thank you, Patrick Falk, for giving your time. That was our correspondent, Patrick Falk, joining us from Beijing. In relation to the previous story, Beijing has urged Washington to end its provocative actions in the South China Sea. This comes after a U.S. warship sailed through waters claimed by China. More in this report. The South China Sea is just one of a number of flashpoints in the US-China relationship. The US has increased its pressure on China by sending a warship through waters the country calls its own. Washington says a vessel sailed within 12 nautical miles of Scarborough Reef Island, a territory claimed by China. Responding, Beijing said its navy warned the ship to leave. Foreign Ministry spokesman Liu Kang called the act a violation of Chinese sovereignty.
China's Navy identified and investigated the US ship in accordance with the law and also gave them a warning. I must stress once again that the US warship's relevant actions have violated China's sovereignty and undermined the peace, security, and good order in the relevant sea areas. China is firmly opposed to this.
Liu Kang said China will do whatever necessary to protect its sovereignty.
We strongly urge the United States to immediately stop such provocative actions so as not to undermine Sino-US relations and regional peace and stability. China will continue to do what it needs to protect its national sovereignty and security and uphold the peace and stability of the South China Sea.
This has been the second such US military operation in the South China Sea in a month. More from the U.S. President Donald Trump has been ordered to release his tax records by a U.S. court. The directive came after Trump lost a lawsuit challenging a subpoena from congressional Democrats seeking his tax returns. District Judge Amit Mehta ordered Trump's accountants to hand over his records to Congress within 7 days. The court also denied a request by Trump to stay the decision pending an appeal. Trump attacked the judge's credibility, calling him an Obama appointee and accusing him of political bias.
Well, we disagree with that ruling. It's crazy because you look at it, this never happened to any other president. They're trying to get a redo. They're trying to get what we used to call in school a do-over. And if you look, we had no collusion, we had no obstruction, we had no nothing.
In New Zealand, terrorism charges have been filed against the man who killed 51 Muslims at 2 mosques in Christchurch. Brenton Tarrant also faces 51 charges of murder and 40 of attempted murder. Police said Tarrant has been charged under Section 6A of the Terrorism Suppression Act 2002. The decision for the terror charge was made after consultations with prosecutors and government legal experts. Tarrant, a 28-year-old Australian, is currently held at a high-security prison undergoing psychological tests. His next court appearance is scheduled for June the 14th. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro has proposed early elections for the National Assembly. The US-backed opposition leader Juan Guaido won a majority in the Congress in 2015. Speaking at a rally to mark 1 year since his victory, Maduro did not set a date for the vote, which is scheduled for late 2020. Maduro said he will legitimize the sole institution which has not been done in the last 5 years. Citing political unrest in the country, Maduro said elections are a peaceful democratic solution. Guaido invoked the constitution to assume an interim presidency in January. Meanwhile, Guaido's envoy met Pentagon officials in Washington to discuss the Venezuelan crisis. China and the European Union have signed 2 landmark agreements boosting their cooperation in the aviation sector. Under the deals, Beijing and Brussels will recognize each other's evaluations and certifications for aeronautical products. The agreements will make it easier for Chinese airlines to fly in the 28-nation European Union. The bilateral civil aviation safety agreement will also promote cooperation on safeguards and environmental compatibility. In Indonesia, presidential candidate Prabowo Subianto has said he will challenge the results of the 2019 general election outcome at the Constitutional Court. This comes after official results confirmed incumbent President Joko Widodo's victory in last month's polls. The president, also known as Jokowi, took 55% of the vote, 10% more than his challenger Subianto. Results were revealed earlier than expected amid fears of unrest. Subianto has warned of possible uprisings in support of his claims of widespread cheating. Scorching summer heat has sabotaged rehabilitation efforts in India's eastern state of Odisha after Cyclone Fani struck earlier this month. Over 10 million were affected by the worst summer cyclone in the state in over 4 decades. More than 1 million people were displaced. The cyclone uprooted trees, destroyed crops, and contaminated water bodies. It also snapped communication and power lines. 2 weeks on, only 3% of homes in Odisha's Puri district have had power supplies restored. Nearly 300,000 people are now exposed to peak summer heat, with temperatures topping 40 degrees Celsius. Relief workers are now putting systems into place to enable people to deal with the severe heat. Nearly 400 members of the U.S. Congress have written to President Donald Trump urging him not to withdraw military forces from Syria. In a letter, the bipartisan group asked Trump to address threats posed by militant groups in Syria. They also asked him to ensure Israel's security. Last December, Trump announced plans to pull out American troops from Syria. Displaced Syrian families in Turkey are returning to Syria to celebrate Eid al-Fitr with loved ones. More than 5.6 million Syrians have been forced to flee their country since 2011.
Syrian families have long suffered a brutal conflict which has killed hundreds of thousands of people. The war has created the world's largest refugee crisis. Now thousands of people taking refuge in Turkey are returning across Al-Hava border to celebrate Eid al-Fitr in Syria.
We sought refuge because of the situation in Syria and because of the war, destruction and airstrikes. It's been 2 years since I visited and I'm here to see my family and relatives. Thankfully, everything here at the crossing went great.
Last year, around 60,000 people crossed the Bab al-Hava border, although that number is expected to decline this year. Authorities help people to return by providing free buses and other vehicles.
Last year, the number of Syrian displaced families arriving to celebrate Eid al-Fitr in Syria reached 60,000 persons, excluding children. This year, we are expecting the entry of 35,000 persons.
Each year, the Turkish government allows the refugees to cross over into Syria to celebrate Eid.
Yemen's Houthi rebels have claimed a drone attack targeting an airport in Saudi Arabia's Najran city. The Yemen government coalition spokesman, Colonel Turki al-Maliki, has warned the rebels against drone attacks. In a press conference, al-Maliki said there would be a strong deterrent to such attacks. He did not mention any casualties. Earlier, Saudi Arabia said it intercepted 2 Houthi ballistic missiles near the city of Taif. Meanwhile, the UN has said it's considering suspending and deliveries in areas under the control of Houthi rebels in Yemen. The World Food Programme blamed fighting, lack of access to the hungry, and interference in its work by local authorities for the situation. In a letter, the UN humanitarian organization said Houthis should abide by agreements to ensure food supplies are not diverted. The organization was referring to accords the World Food Programme signed with the belligerents in December and January. According to World Health Organization, tens of thousands have been killed during the Yemen conflict since March 2015. The fighting has triggered a humanitarian crisis with 3 million people displaced and 24 million in need of aid. Qatar says it has not been invited to 2 regional summits called to discuss attacks on Saudi oil assets. The Arab League says it has sent invitations to member states. Saudi Arabia has called a summit of Gulf Arab rulers and a wider meeting of Arab leaders in Makkah on May 30th. This follows last week's drone strikes on oil pipelines in Saudi Arabia and attacks on 4 vessels off the coast of the UAE. In another development, Austrian ministers from the far-right Freedom Party have resigned. The resignations follow the sacking of the Interior Minister Herbert Kickl over a corruption scandal. Chancellor Sebastian Kurz forced Kickl out of office to ensure a transparent investigation. Ministers from Defense, Transport and Social Affairs were among those who resigned in protest. The Chancellor said senior civil servants will serve cabinet positions until September's elections. Kickl's corruption scandal ended the right-wing coalition between the People's Party and the Freedom Party. However, to remain in power after the elections, Chancellor Kurz will need another coalition partner. British Prime Minister Theresa May will hold a key cabinet meeting on Brexit today. She is expected to finalize amendments to Brexit legislation in order to get her deal with the European Union through Parliament at the 4th attempt. The cabinet is expected to sign off on what May has called an improved package of measures. The proposals cover EU trade agreements and border control with the Republic of Ireland, among other issues. To find a deal that Parliament may back, ministers will also consider holding indicative votes. Finance Minister Philip Hammond has warned against a no-deal Brexit before the cabinet meeting. May remains under pressure from her own MPs to resign. Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage has been splattered with a milkshake. Farage was doused with the sticky drink while campaigning for this week's European Parliament election. The incident took place shortly after Farage finished his address to supporters in Newcastle. A suspect in his early 30s was taken away by police. A disgruntled-looking Farage was later escorted away by aides into a taxi. In a tweet, Farage blamed the incident on radicalized EU supporters who have made normal campaigning impossible. Farage's Brexit Party is leading the polls on its promise to get Britain out quickly. However, protesters have been targeting right-wing figures on the European Parliament campaign trail. Spurred by their opposition to Brexit, several European expatriates are taking the leap into politics. Hoping to avoid Brexit, Britain's pro-EU enthusiasts are ready to try their luck in the European elections. Details in this report. The election was a vote Britain was never supposed to take part in. Unlike the 2016 referendum, European expatriates living in Britain can both vote and stand as candidates. Firmly anti-Brexit, Peter Glasov is from Denmark, and he has been living in the UK for 40 years.
I think about it a lot. It's always on my mind. I made a home here, have children, all my work has been here. So this is my home. And I feel it's under threat.
The delay in Brexit has inevitably made the Europolls a way to challenge the entire process. Jan Rostowski served as finance minister in Poland and briefly as deputy prime minister. He is standing for the newly formed Change UK and anti-Brexit party in London.
The best deal for Britain is to stay in the EU. And indeed, Britain, out of all the EU countries, had the best deal in the EU compared to all the others.
Spanish nurse Juan Pons Laplana moved to the UK 19 years ago and made the leap into politics as a result of Brexit. Running for Change UK, he has been campaigning to ensure EU expatriates are registered to vote in Britain.
The best thing to guarantee and to save the future of England is to vote in England, and that's what I say. But a lot of people, when I talk to people, Europeans say, I want to vote in France, I want to vote in Spain, is because if Brexit happens, a lot of them are planning to go back to their country, and that for me is very alarming.
With the two opposing views polarizing Britain, Brexit is the only solution in the country's EU elections. Now from the business world, financial stocks with Asian exposure have led a recovery on Asian and European stock markets after the US eased restrictions on Chinese telecom giant Huawei. The Shanghai Composite Index gained 1%, while London's FTSE 100 was up 0.5% in early trading. There were gains in South Korea and Australia too. Earlier, shares of US technology companies fell sharply after Google began to sever ties with Huawei. The tech-oriented Nasdaq Composite Index tumbled by nearly 1.5%.
That came out during the course of
And now bringing you stories from the world of sports. In the NBA, the Golden State Warriors have swept their way into the finals after defeating the Portland Trail Blazers by 4-0. The Warriors edged Trail Blazers in overtime by 119 points to 117. In the Western Conference thriller, the fourth quarter of the game ended at 111 points. Stephen Curry and Draymond Green capped triple-double performances for the Warriors. The triple-doubles were the first by teammates in NBA's postseason history. Curry posted 37 points, 13 rebounds, and 11 assists. Warriors have cruised to their fifth consecutive NBA Finals with this victory. The Warriors will now face the winner of Eastern Conference Finals in the NBA Championship finale. Now let's take a quick look at the weather around the globe. This is all we have for you this hour. Remember, you can find us on our website to follow up details on the main stories. Just type indus.news in your browser.